Hello everyone, I'm delighted to see so many people here today. Céad míle fáilte, as we say, as Gaeilge in Irish in Ireland. It's 5 p.m. in Ireland and a lovely bright sunny day, and I'm delighted to see each and every one of you here. I know it's a big group, so unfortunately I won't get to hear many of your voices and many of your questions, but I would invite you to, as thoughts occur to you during the session, put them into the chat. I'll try and pick up on them as I'm going through, because you really helped me with this in terms of prompting what you need to know. And then my colleague at the end, Professor Carmichael, will pick up on any major issues that I may have overlooked. So please bear with me. So let me share my slides firstly, if I'm able to. Are you able to see that?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, great. So absolutely delighted to be sharing my experience with you in relation to publication. And today's particular focus I am to understand is writing for a global audience. So just to give you a bit of introduction and a welcome, I hope that the short workshop will give you a greater understanding generally of the writing for publication process, but in particular this writing for an international audience, ensuring for yourselves a successful way forward for publication. And of course, I must focus primarily on the Journal of Nursing Management, because that is where my expertise, generally speaking, lies. But I will explain a little of the context to you, my context, which I think is quite important. Firstly, as outlined, I am editor-in-chief of the Journal of Nursing Management. So I'm reading more than 500 papers per year. So I'm seeing what is being submitted, what's being accepted, what's being rejected. And I've been previously editor of the journal and other journals in the past. So that editorial side, the helicopter view of what's coming in, but also I'm on editorial boards for other journals as well, and an author myself of almost 200 papers and a couple of hundred conference papers, 11 textbooks, and so on. So there's this apprenticeship, if you like, of writing from both perspectives. So I'm writing myself, submitting, revising, being rejected sometimes, and also then at the other side of things, looking at papers, advising on them, advising on revising, and also rejecting. So I see it from both sides. And in particular, we're talking about a global audience, or writing for a global audience. I come, as you know, from Ireland. So my particular context in relation to the Irish healthcare system or the Irish university system is slightly different to even our very near neighbours, which is the United Kingdom, and certainly to the United States and other parts of the English-speaking world and other parts of the world. So I have, throughout my 20-year career of writing, had to continuously explain to the outside, if you like, what I was talking about. So I've really got for quite familiar with this explanation to the others, if you like, I guess, in a way. And if I say to you that, for example, a lot of the journals are housed either within the United States, nursing and healthcare journals, or within the United Kingdom. So they tend to have their own particular context. So if you're publishing within that, everyone understands what you're talking about. But once you move outside of that, or you're from outside of that, things get a little bit more complicated. So learning how to actually speak to those audiences, wherever they may be, is very useful. Now, that said as well, of course, the editorial board and the reviewers are from all over the world now. There was a time, even as close as 20 years ago, where my colleagues would receive the papers in, the manuscripts, hard copy, papers onto the desk in Oxford, put them into envelopes and send them to peer reviewers around the United Kingdom. That day, as you know, has completely changed. So you now are having to submit your paper, and your reviewer could be in any part of the world. So we're really in an environment of preparing our work for people with very, very different perspectives. And I suppose, in short, I have a multi-angled experience of these multiple perspectives, including being the outsider, if you like. Even so far as some of those, actually with my little pointer, some of those committees that I've been on, can't really see any, oh, there we are. Here, the editorial board membership and conference committees, I've actually reviewed abstracts, could you believe it or not, that I don't actually fully understand. They're written in English, but they're so contextualized to the particular environment that it actually doesn't make sense. And I suppose I'm going to hint during the presentation today how you can kind of get over that, insofar as how do you make your writing so that someone like myself from a different country reads it and really understands it and gets it. So I found that really fascinating, that you could have a paper from the north of England and really not know what they're talking about, or a paper from Canada, for example, recently could not understand anything in the abstract. Okay, so the journal then itself, just a little bit about that. And this was important. I mean, we could almost stop our session right now on this landing page, because almost everything is here that you need. Very often we're concerned with, is my work good enough? You may have finished off in your professional D&P program and maybe have got very good results, but still a bit nervous. Maybe, am I good enough? Do they really want this? And we get more concerned about whether we or our work is worthy, rather than the really big tip, which is fitting your paper with the journal. And this fitting your paper with the journal is the same thing really as writing for a global audience, insofar as your journal is the global audience. So it's sitting it within that journal space, which actually looks out to this global audience, which is the readers, the editors, the reviewers, and so on and so forth. So the landing page here tells you everything you need to know about that audience. Who are they? So for example, in the about, we'll show you in a moment, the aims and scope. This journal aims to provide information on leadership for nurses, practitioners working in healthcare practice. So this page will tell you who the global audience are, who the audience are, who the editors are, other information, how to submit, and so on and so forth. You can browse, and it's very, very important. We can browse through articles in the journal, even from a title perspective, the most recent, the most downloaded, the most cited, get a feel for the conversation in this particular journal. So I often say it's almost like going to, you know, your graduation ball or a wedding celebration or a party in a completely different country. You wouldn't arrive into that party with a pre-prepared dialogue of, I come from Ireland, I live in a house and 3 bedrooms. You would actually sit very quietly at that party, wait until all the other conversation goes on, touch base with people to see what common ground you have, if you like, and then begin to build the conversation. Is that correct? And it's the same with writing publication. You don't dive bomb your work into the journal. You pretend you act like it's a conversation. So you try to sit it within this journal in a conversational style. So we don't dive in, as I mentioned, at our wedding or a party or a ceremony and start giving a lecture on the world of nursing academia and all I know about it, without ever asking anybody any questions, only to realize the guest beside you is the Dean of John Hopkins or something. You know, you actually find out what's going on in that little conversation before you say too much. And it's exactly what you need to do with this landing page before you ever start, is know the journal, know the aims and scope, and begin to position your work in this particular journal. And imagine you're speaking to the audience, this audience. So some of this is using your imagination, your creativity. So when I'm writing, I'm actually imagining I'm writing for Amanda Henderson, Violetta Lopez, Laura Peltonen. So this is one of our major audiences because they see your papers firstly, myself. And then we have an editorial board. For many journals, the editorial board serve as the reviewers only, and they don't go outside of that pool. And other journals like my own journal have hundreds and thousands actually of other types of reviewers. But it gives you a sense of background of and who the audience is, maybe what countries they're positioned in, if that makes sense. So the overview, the aims and scope of the journal, as I said, very, very important. I'm just going to move, apologies. My pointer is just slightly in the way of my, there we go, just move that up. So this is the aims and scope, and this is essentially really important. You ask, how do you publish for a global audience? Read the aims and scope. It might seem a very basic thing, and you might imagine, well, surely one would always read the instructions, but in fact, in reality, and this goes for myself, is that in our eagerness to publish and trying to get over the line, or that eagerness to see, am I worthy, we don't really look at the simple things and stop and say, well, what is this actually about? What are they looking for? And everything is here, all the tips. It's an international forum, advances the discipline, encourages scholarly debate, publishes current issues, welcomes papers from researchers. It aims to inform practitioners, debate current issues, develop best practice in management and leadership, examine policy developments, and address issues in governance, safety, and quality. So all of this is really, again, when you're shaping your paper, and it's the shaping the paper that is essential. As I've mentioned, we're concerned about worthiness, but in fact, the majority of work that you have done, if you have conducted your research in a way that is ethical, and robust, well, then there's no reason why it can't be published. Similarly, any type of review that has followed along with methodological rigor should be worthy of publication. So the actual methods and findings, if, for example, this is the work that you've done, they are very often as is. That is what you have found. What we're doing when we're writing is actually the other topping and tailing, almost, if you like, what we would call it in our country. The introduction, discussion, background, very important, and then discussion and conclusion. So that conversation at both sides of your work is what helps you to fit in the global context, because it is an international forum. It's like being at an international party, if you like, where you want to speak to people around the table. So you have to somehow massage those conversations to that. And you might say, well, how do you do that? Some of it is just imagining and picturing who this audience are and being confident in using your own words and your own voice to do so. And I'll come back to that. So just a point that we do have some special issues, for example, that again, it can be difficult to get published. And I know from experience, speaking to my colleagues earlier on, that there is a disappointment when we don't get published. And in fact, a lot of journals have an almost 75% rejection rate. So it can be difficult, and particularly, and I'll come to this in some of my slides, where you are repeating information that's already known. Very often the journal editors want something new, and that's quite challenging. So what can be helpful is if there is a special issue, they are looking for something very focused and probably will allow a certain amount of repeat information because they're building, sort of one package, if you like, for the reader. So our special issues are as follows: artificial intelligence, ethics, sustainable development, and healthcare. Just worth noting that. So our journal has three main questions at the very beginning. Does this paper contribute anything new? Are the implications for nurses and nurse managers highlighted? And is it written in clear English? And what they say there as well is if the answer is no to all three questions, stop and consider the need to continue the review. This is for the reviewers, or reject this manuscript. So there's three main tips. What's new? Have you followed alongside the aims and scope? Are you speaking to the audience? So in this case, our nurses, nurse managers. And of course, is it of clear English and acceptable standard? Now, you might say, well, for us now here today, we can forget about that last section because we all speak English. Well, what I would say to you is that I have had, and maybe this is just me, but certainly I have had more than one occasion, if not three, and I think I had it even in the last 2 weeks, a request to get assistance from someone whose first language is English. So there's an expression issue sometimes with cross-cultural, or just generally speaking in relation to how we write. And I'll come to that in terms of style very, very shortly. So we're paying attention to all of these things. So when we're talking about global, really, and international, we really, very often we're talking about the fit, of course, the language we use, fitting with the aims and scope, but the novelty. And this is an issue because if you're writing for an area that really has heard this before, well, then what you're struggling to do then is to add to that body of knowledge. But that's possible. It's really, again, how you position and how you write. So just a couple of trends to note from our journal, just out of interest. This is over the years how much the submissions have increased. So you can see, and this is across many, many journals, that there's been a twofold, threefold, fourfold increase in submissions. And in fact, we're publishing more. Similarly, the downloads, I mean, look at that fourfold increase in downloads to 1.2 million there last year. And the activity then, or another slide there actually is missing, where there's a trend in the downloads in terms of January, February, March, April, very busy, then the summertime eases off, and then there's a huge amount of downloading in the beginning of September, October, November, eases off in December. So basically what I'm showing off, of course, in relation to the journal, that we have a lot of activity, but that there are peaks and troughs in this, and there's a huge volume of work being done, a huge volume of submissions. So your work is being presented to the journal at very busy periods. In fact, every period is a very busy period. And why am I saying this? And I'm going to come to it in a later slide, is that really when you're presenting your work, again, think back to finishing the program of study that you've done or the piece of research that you've done, and you're just wondering, is it good enough? And you may be put into the journal just to see what happens. That's not really a good idea, because that's your one chance. And you really haven't adapted the paper in the way that I'm suggesting to fit with the journal. And what we're doing really when we're submitting, we are seeking approval. However, the review that the editor-in-chief or the editor will give to your paper is usually a very cursory review, which I will come to. And I'm just suggesting here that these are busy, busy journals. The editors are busy, the reviewers are busy. It's a quick-paced review that you are getting. So you need to put your best foot forward when you are writing your paper, particularly in your title, your abstract, and the flow throughout the paper, to make sure that you put your best work and an attempt to address some of those issues around novelty, around being clear on what you're writing, contributing to the aims and scope, and attempting sort of internationality. One tip that Professor Hugh McKenna gave, you may not recall it himself, but I do remember it vividly at an after-dinner speech, which was incredibly amusing, very enjoyable. But he suggested putting the word internationality or internationally into the first few sentences of the paper. I thought it was brilliant. In fact, I do it myself now, but I don't do it to leave the word internationally or internationality or in. I do it as a little hook to remind myself in that introduction background section that I'm not talking about Dublin, Ireland, or London, England. I'm talking about perhaps that subject area or that study in that field, but I'm speaking to everybody or all nurses internationally. So it helps pivot me and allows me to just swing off that and remember. So I thought that was a good tip, just have the word internationality. So internationally, nursing students are internationally advanced practice is, and immediately begin to think, hang on a second now, I don't know internationally what advanced practice is, or I might have some idea, but I really haven't pinned it in this particular piece of work because I was writing it for the New York context or the Dublin context, if that makes sense. So it allows you to open up and start thinking about the rest of the world. So my steps to success are around planning, preparing, persistence, and perseverance. And I'm just going to touch on those in relation to the global. So I suggest around planning that you start with your publication plan at the outset, agreeing your authorship and timelines, and choose the journal. And again, this is very important, generally speaking, hugely important in your publication career, that you pick the journal that you think fits best with the work that you're actually doing, or else that your work is sufficiently altered to fit with the actual journal. So it's not about am I good enough or not, it's about the fit. And that choosing a journal, that can apply to internationality as well. That if you have a piece of work and perhaps attempt to submit it to a journal that's very much rooted in a particular country, you could have difficulty unless you adapt absolutely to that. I had that experience with an Australian journal where I prepared a paper for another journal that wasn't accepted with a group. And I didn't do all things that I mentioned to you, didn't prepare it for the context, didn't look into the journal to see what conversation was going on, didn't think about the Australian context. And again, all journals profess to internationality, but they're still rooted in their own frame of reference. So they know the policy on that topic in their country. So of course, what happened, I put in the paper, it was immediately rejected. And the comment was that it hadn't sufficiently dealt with the issue and area of spirituality in Australia, and really what I was talking about was not quite far off the mark basically in relation to their particular policy. So choose your journal and fit with the journal. The preparation then in preparing for the journal after your planning, top line internationality. Novelty is hand in hand with that really in a way. And I would just encourage you, and I know it might seem a little off topic, but if I could just stress the point of style, that it's important for you to have an originality in your message and your voice. And why am I saying that? This helps us with novelty, firstly. And also, if you allow yourself to speak freely and to write freely, you're more inclined to have that clarity around your own context. So what I mean by that is when we are writing sometimes at undergraduate or postgraduate level, we're inclined to cut and paste or over paraphrase. So there develops this sort of clunky academic writing style that really can be almost obtuse and meaningless in some cases. And it gets very superficial, doesn't really explain things clearly. You can get away with as a reasonably good essay or even sort of part of a master's or dissertation essay, but it doesn't allow sufficient depth that when you're at this point and you want absolute clarity about the context in your country, you've too much copying and paraphrasing going on. I'll explain more about that in a moment. So I'm just sort of saying, be careful of the style or watch the style, try to be original in both the message that you're giving, but also the voice and the type of language that you use. Minimal paraphrasing. There's a term, I'm not even sure I know how to pronounce it, but I've written about it in one of my papers around, an author has written about rogeting. So Roget's thesaurus, it's a famous thesaurus, where you can actually, thesaurus is a book, where you find other words for words. And this is typically what we would do when we're writing essays. Get a quote from an article, put into my essay, look at the thesaurus and move things around. That's not academic writing. So this person in their paper described it as rogeting, but you're basically just, applying a thesaurus to bulk quotations, and it just distorts the originality and style. I'll come to that and explain it a little bit in a moment. And you need to fit with the journal conversation. And really, really important is consideration of the context, that we don't dive into advanced practice in Canada has developed. It is important for us to understand the context, but we need to start fairly global and then move into what you're speaking about in relation to Canada. Make no assumptions of the context and also explain your context. So Professor Roger Watson, who was editor-in-chief, as many people know, of the Journal of Advanced Nursing for a number of years, and now is editor-in-chief of Nurse Education and Practice, he sums up a lot of this in terms of a nice podcast that he's done in relation to desk reject. So this is where the editor-in-chief outright rejects from the very beginning. So he's suggesting there that, most editors of high quality journals have a system for reviewing the manuscript quickly. And he'll tell you what he normally does. The editor-in-chief sees the manuscript and they're looking for 4 things: fit, the title, which should be short and descriptive, the abstract according to the presentation guidelines, and a very cursory view of specific content. So he repeats it as fit, title, abstract, and content. And he said it, this is his words, "I must add, at this stage of the process, it doesn't usually involve me reading the manuscript in great detail in order to make a decision." And this is something as novice authors we don't really realize. The other side of it, we think, we're getting judged almost like analysed in maybe the way that you would within your study programs within the university. But not at all. I mean, and maybe you might say on the one hand, well, maybe I deserve that, but in fact, maybe you don't, because the volume of work that the editor-in-chief is doing, they have so much experience, they know at a glance what's going to work and what's not going to work. So what I'm saying is to sort of raise that awareness that this can be a very quick decision. And I've heard editor-in-chief actually say that their review takes 2 minutes. Now, why do I say that to you? That is because you have to elevator pitch, catch the editor-in-chief's attention very, very quickly. And if you have some of the major flaws that I will mention in relation to style, fit, context, language, internationality, you will be caught in the first round and end up with a desk reject, as I know too from experience. This is just a quotation from a conversation among editors, which is interesting. It's paraphrased. "Joan, I'm curious, do you receive many submissions from the international community? About 10 years ago, I added a few scholars from Great Britain, Australia, and other areas, and the manuscript submissions picked up. I now have an editorial board, members from several very reputable international universities, and get a steady stream of submissions of manuscripts that do very well through the review process. Do you have any contacts abroad? Have you had any visiting scholars?" And the response from another editor was, "No, but we receive a significant number of international manuscripts, mainly from Asia, Brazil, Turkey, and Iran. Unfortunately, many of the papers describe studies that we have done in the States years ago, so there's no new nursing knowledge." So I suppose this tells you how a context can be very context bound, but also how internationality, global audience is very much wrapped up in novelty. And expressing novelty within a paper is a key aspect of being successful at publication. So I'll just give you an example of one of my own recent rejections, 12th of November. "Dear Timmins, my title, your manuscript is now being considered. While the issues you discuss are important, I'm sorry to let you know that we're unable to publish it. Unfortunately, the submission does not engage adequately with the history of ideas previously published in the target journal and wider field of disabilities, but effectively in the target journal, and better suited to a different journal. And I hope to give you better news the next time." So just sort of proving to you, if you like, that the fit is incredibly important. These slides in relation to style, originality, and voice, these show, and they are blurred deliberately, manuscripts where there have been large pieces of text taken from other sources with minimal paraphrasing. Now, there's one of the reasons, and I have this slide from an article, that this happens is that we're used, as I mentioned, to this type of writing where we take a large chunk here put it into our essay, change one or two words perhaps, use quotations or not use quotations, but basically our essays become strings of paraphrases. There are issues for a separate discussion, we'll say, around the potential for that to be plagiarism. The Committee on Publication Ethics have recently provided some very good guidance on this in relation to there can be, you know, a certain amount of overlap in relation to own publications and also other publications. So, you know, there is scope for that. However, that's a separate issue that I'm not really discussing today. What I'm really speaking about today is the style and originality. If you have large strings of paraphrases, I can guarantee absolutely that they're out of date, probably, because they're taken from another article, which already is out of date because it's surely been published at least a month ago, which might have been prepared about 2 years ago. And it just has this ring in some topics, like, for example, in my journal, there's the topic of leadership, for example, there are catchphrases and cliches and paraphrasing that just becomes repeated and repeated and repeated, you know, and it might be okay for an essay or for something, but you get that sort of repetition in the beginning of an article, whether it's paraphrased adequately or not, and the work immediately has no novelty. So I just would encourage you, if you have been used to this type of paraphrasing, to really move away from that, unpack yourself from that, and begin to just read your papers, read up-to-date papers, very up-to-date papers, and think about them, analyze them, and write in using your own words. That is actually the way it needs to be done. So again, this is just to show that the paper should not be a string of these highlighted quotes. And in fact, usually when you're looking at papers and published articles, you're not really drawing a huge amount of information from the discussion conclusion. You might note what they've discussed or what they've concluded, or you might note that maybe they've overstated the findings, but to actually take word for word or paraphrase several words is usually not required. If you're analysing papers and they're using that as part of your publication, what you're expected to do is focus on critiquing, critically analysing the main findings, what they found, what they did, why they did it, what are the most important findings, or whether it's a research empirical study or a review, really not looking to copy all of these conclusions. And that again has a huge impact on originality. And worse than that, it actually creates what's called gobbledygook, which is just nonsense. Now, believe it or not, you might think that is impossible. And it used to be one of my favorite words, gobbledygook, when I used to speak to the students as well about don't write gobbledygook. Nobody would sit in a room and write gobbledygook, but somehow when we go to write like in an academic way, we do these copying of paraphrases that when they're put together from various different articles, reads like gobbledygook because it's so disjointed. And also these tend to be very broad statements. Like, for example, the conditions healthcare professionals encounter in primary care exists in life context and must be viewed as part of a life story. What does that mean when you take it out of that context? Actually, probably nothing. And if you add it to something else, what does it mean? Probably nothing. So just be careful that you're confident that you analyze papers for their main primary content and findings, and that you're not over-relying on quotations. This is an example that I showed to you as an audience. I'll just give you a moment, maybe, just to read it yourself, maybe just 3 minutes. Sorry, apologies. So this is really an example I would present to audience just to say to you, look, have a read of that. What do you think? And the audience generally say to me, without any experience of writing publication or any experience of being an editor, I really don't like it. You know, it's awful. You know, what they will say is, look at these gaps in the presentation. This is a really old reference. This doesn't really mean anything. It's very superficial. It's just an example of the opening sentences of a paper, but it gives you these are the type of real life examples of what I would be faced with as editor-in-chief, insofar as, again, something maybe someone has worked on a number of years ago, maybe over-reliance on secondary referencing, so the references are very dated, repeating old information. And again, it seems outside of the remit of global, but it is, because if you want to speak to the global audience, you want to say how your work contributes to the body of knowledge and adds to that. So if you open up with a very bland rehash of already known facts, well then that surely doesn't speak to an international audience. So what I'm saying in terms of style here, you need to be synthesizing and analyzing, and that will help you get to that level where you're speaking to an international audience. This is a really interesting extract from Wikipedia, speaking about Chinese authors, in fact. What it says here is typically the writing courses have focused on the introduction and discussion sections of articles prepared for health science journals in China. The introduction section of the paper has tended to be incomplete, so editors and readers do not understand the point of the paper. And that's really important, that we often, particularly if we're writing for other purposes, such as our program, university, and so on, this introduction and background is based on that purpose. So when you put it into a journal, it's incomplete. The reader and the editor does not really even understand the point of the paper. For example, in this paper, we don't really know what the point is. Where are we going with this? Editors envisage the introduction as being rather like a funnel, beginning with what is known about the particular problem, leading to what is unknown and important to find out, and ending with the objectives of the research. So this funnel idea I really like. What do we know about advanced practice? Generally speaking, can we touch on it globally? Can we then move into, look, the issue really is that while we have advanced practice, we don't have standardized approach to it, and with varying roles. In this hospital in New York, we found that this was a particular problem because, and then we know now that it's really important to find out what are the barriers to moving this forward. This is why we did the research. The research was as follows: plain English, ordinary explanation, clarity, that funnel at the beginning. They say here then that Chinese authors typically begin their discussion then with and this could be the introduction, I suppose, as well, with a reiteration of well-known knowledge and little attempt to indicate how the research adds to the body of knowledge. The discussion section rarely discusses the limitation of the research. So this reiteration of well-known knowledge is incredibly common, and not only for Chinese authors, but for all authors. Again, back to this, caring is a core element of nursing. We know that. There's probably not a single person in nursing who doesn't know that. What do we not know? Okay, if you want to say well-known facts, well, where does your work fit into that? Where's the funnel? What's the problem? Why are you writing? Why are you researching this? What do you need to know? What's your research question? Why are you doing this? Important point here about the limitations is, and I'll come to that as one of the barriers, is that ironically, it's a kind of paradox. On the one hand, you've got to demonstrate novelty and sort of be very out there in terms of this is really important to find out. This is novel because, on the other hand, you've got to be very balanced in terms of your discussion. You oughtn't to overstate the findings. You ought to be incredibly cautious all of the time in terms of the interpretation of your findings for a worldwide audience. So you're saying, well, look, while we found that the advanced practitioners in the emergency department in New York found that their role, clarity, and problems with that affected their day-to-day functioning, we really can't say whether that's applicable beyond this particular setting because. Now, we all know when we're writing papers that we tend to have a limitation section, but the limitation section very often are very, very banal. Really just, this study is limited by the fact that it's a cohort. So liven it up, tell the reader why we oughtn't to necessarily place huge confidence in the findings. Again, have that conversation. If I was to say, if you were to take one word from this, or two words maybe, or three: originality, fit, and conversation. That will get you your global audience. And what's really interesting, this is a paper, an email from one of my own authors in the journal who I don't know, but would have submitted a paper, then received the feedback from the reviewers, not necessarily myself, and then took the time then just to explain that they had worked according to the reviewers' comments and how they found that. And they said they're excited to receive the news about the revision. They thanked the reviewer, and then they felt it helped the manuscript. It's all very, very nice and very polite, and we've revised. But what I thought was interesting is here, following these valuable suggestions, we have rewritten the background section of the manuscript. And we sincerely hope that it could provide international readers with a clearer context of the current status of midwifery in China. At the same time, we're delighted that you're interested in midwifery management and the core competencies of the midwifery workforce in China. And we hope that a clear and comprehensive description of core competencies in the Chinese midwifery workforce could provide insights for other developing countries to assess their core competencies. And so on. So this is just with their permission, I've included this. But I thought it was interesting that, this is a random paper with someone I don't know who's gone to a random reviewer who is basically effectively saying the very same thing. And it's fairly applicable to most papers we receive. Give us that background introduction, that funnel. What's the situation of midwifery in China? Don't rehash, midwifery is very important for the whole world, advanced midwifery practices, get that, tell us what's going on in that particular context and why it's important in terms of the rest of the world. And this just gives you an idea of that same paper. The blue is the additions, how much they added to their background in order to make that grade. So fitting with the journal conversation, Roger Watson again suggests that discussion is often the key to success. This is a real difficulty. And I would have to say it's incredibly common that the discussion presented in your published paper or your paper that's submitted for publication is simply a repeat of the findings. Your discussion ought not to be a repeat of the findings. You present the findings, whether they're themes from qualitative research, whether they're themes from a review of some kind, whether they're statistical findings from an empirical study. The findings are the findings. Within the discussion, the purpose is to identify the priority findings and others, and compare these findings in relation to international research, up-to-date international research. So the discussion should be fairly logical, more or less prioritized in terms of the main findings, and giving very clear recommendations and discussion for the international audience. So don't repeat, and allow this to be really the place where you start to have that conversation with the global audience, and also make sometimes we have a section called recommendations, but implicit within that discussion should be what you're suggesting and recommending. And again, it may seem fairly straightforward, but the majority of us don't want to go the extra mile because we just want to see, would it work in its present format? It won't work in its present format. If you have written recommendations for advanced practice in Dublin, in Ireland, it's unlikely that they're going to be what is needed for the remainder of the world or what the rest of the world will find interesting. You've got to pick out what you think are important findings for the global audience. And also too, don't be welded. Roger Watson has said, don't be welded to your words. You may have had those words in the report initially. You may have had those words in your dissertation. It's time to let them go. You might actually write a totally different discussion because you've got to now piece out, unpick the findings that really are the novel findings or something that you find is interesting. Back to the landing page, if you look at the most downloaded, the most cited, the most recent, you can get a feel in that journal for the discussions that are going on. And if you read through some of those papers, you might find it stimulates your brain to think, oh my goodness, I really need to look at contextualizing my findings in the discussion in this way, because we're really talking about this now in advanced practice. That's a really hot topic. I don't know if that makes sense, that you sort of have to, your discussion is not a bland thesis-like thing that sits there not moving from the moment you write it. It's a life-like thing that when you go to write your paper, it's continuously changing and shaping in relation to the conversation that's going on in that journal. And again, back to novelty, unless you do that and try and get into this conversation and discuss your findings in relation to that journal and other international work, you're going to find that you're not adding to the body of knowledge. So you discuss the findings in relation to the research question. Importantly, include your limitations. I've mentioned don't overstate the findings. Recommendations for international. Imagine in your brain you're speaking to those editors. You've read who they are. Imagine I'm speaking now to somebody based in a 100-bedded ICU in China. Imagine I'm speaking to somebody in a New York emergency department. It just has to take a bit of imagination. You really are moving beyond your own context. And then did you achieve the aims of the study? Persistence, very important. Why? Because failure is common. There is a very high rejection rate. It can be challenging for us as humans to have the rejection. And I know of many people who have kind of not really, it seems a bit extreme, but they almost haven't come back from that. They hide away that paper that was rejected. They take their time out and don't publish for a while. I even had an experience where somebody quite closely engaged with the journal had a rejection and really had taken it was before my time as editor-in-chief, and when I went to inquire about reviewing, they were very disinclined to review because it had a rejection. So whether we like it or not, the rejection can be quite hard-hitting. I used to find that the rejections tended to come on the wrong day. I thought, oh my God, why is it always a day where you really, really don't need it? And I've discovered in recent years, I did share this at the editors' conference, that I've discovered quite simply that they happen on Monday morning. And the reason they happen on Monday morning is because the editors work at the weekends, So you finish submitting on Friday, you get it off really late. This is fantastic. Have a great weekend, come in Monday morning, a little bit tired, and next thing rejection. Oh my goodness, after all that effort, So just, you've got to be persistent and move beyond that. Try to prevent it if you can. So in terms of why you might be rejected, overinterpretation of results, again, back into the global audience. If you want to suggest that this is really important for advanced practice, we need to look at it. You're really only talking about how we do it in Ireland. You're overinterpreting. Yes, the balance between saying it's novel and it's wonderful. But if you overinterpret, well, then that doesn't show that you understand, the sort of the bias that could be there in research, but B, that you'd understand this is for the world, if you like, if that's possible. That your text is difficult to follow, that you have an insufficient problem statement. So back to this, don't be repeating advanced practice is important for the world, everybody, really dig into what was the impetus for this study? What's the problem? Outdated literature, very important. If you have a reviewer or an editor who knows their stuff, they will spot immediately that you've missed some literature. But generally speaking, and this isn't an absolute rule, but certainly after 5 years of editor-in-chief, most reviewers will look for the last 5 years, regardless of whether they're specialist or not specialist. And the majority will be expecting fairly up-to-date literature. If your literature is older, 2006, 2002, unless it's seminal or you really want to say that this is incredibly important to include, it's not really needed unless it's part of your
Where's your citation?
Review findings. Yeah, pardon? Oh, somebody talking there. Pardon? That's Pearson there. Okay. So failure to communicate clearly, results, conclusions not supported by your results, your study doesn't support the inferences made, uncritical acceptance of statistical findings, failure to consider alternative explanations. So these advanced practitioners may have found this very facilitative. However, we must bear in mind that this was part of a private healthcare context in the United States. So it's amazing, there's quite a lot there about the interpretation. And again, that's back into having this conversation and imagining you're speaking to a large audience. Again, a rehash of established facts, try and be a little bit different. So the common reviewers' comments then, interesting enough, is that the paper does not fit the journal's aim and scope. The literature is outdated, the methodology is unclear, there's problems with logical flow of arguments. Some of this is to do with style, to do with paraphrasing that I previously mentioned. The discussion repeats findings or no new information, limited application beyond specific context, and the limitations are not included. This limited application beyond specific context really just takes a bit of thinking, as I mentioned in the discussion. And I can actually say to you, quite honestly, that this would be fairly standard. Most of the reviewers' comments are actually fairly similar once you've seen hundreds and hundreds of them. And this is roughly speaking. And of course, logic would say to you then, if you can fit with the journal, if you have up-to-date literature, if you're clear in your writing, if you write logically and have a substantive argument flowing through, if your discussion does not repeat the findings and you show new information and you apply it beyond the context, including the limitations, well, they'll surely will be published. You never fail until you stop trying. Be persistent and aim to stand out and be different. I mentioned to you, this is an example of a reviewer's comments. I congratulate you, so very positive. However, at this moment, I do not indicate publication as a result of not identifying new knowledge produced. The results are similar to previous studies, not allowing advances in the field. So contribute to something new, no, and then it wasn't clear in terms of English. This was only about a month ago. So it's just, that's what we need to do to get over the bar. How does it advance at your field? And you surely the work that you've done has been done to advance the field. People don't conduct work like this and put this amount of effort in for no reason whatsoever. It's really about allowing yourself the freedom to articulate that. Persevering then as well, looking here at Jodie Picoul, award-winning popular author who had 100 rejection letters from agents, and then finally somebody took her on. So most successful people have had a number of failures. Watson again, what type of papers are most likely to be accepted? Difficult for editors to say. The most likely are those that adhere to the guidelines fully. So again, I suppose it's the simple things that count: short titles, abstracts that follow guidance, and manuscripts that follow guidance. The content: manuscripts that repeat old studies without producing any reasonable new information and have been replicated without justification don't really appeal to us. Roger Watson with Karen Holland, who's the previous editor of Nurse Education and Practice, they do a very nice book, Writing for Publication and Nursing and Healthcare Getting It Right, which is in its second edition, and I would recommend to you. It's very, very useful. And I don't have it on this particular slide, but I would just say to you in terms of your writing, that one thing that is very, very important, I was mentioning earlier on gobbledygook, there is a campaign for plain English, both in the United States and the United Kingdom. And if you search, you would find sort of reference to that. And really it's sort of it's almost a facetious campaign to sort of get people within the public sphere in relation to governmental departments and so on to write in a more user-friendly way. But they have some very amusing anecdotes about sections of work that really sound incredibly clever, but in fact ultimately are meaningless. So I guess what I'm just saying to you is that ultimately one of the most important and easiest ways, if you like, to actually write for a global audience is to write plainly, simply and clearly, because in that way you're explaining everything naturally as you go along. Don't be tempted to use the kind of gobbledygook, the big words, the multiple paraphrasing, the obscure cliches from the discipline. You know, if you aim for absolute clarity in your writing, and be really distilling everything you're talking about down to its simplest and finest, well then you will find it much easier to be successful in relation to publishing, generally speaking, but also certainly globally and internationally. And if we think about it being like a conversation, we speak, generally speaking, relatively straightforward and simply. We don't, and if we find that we're having a misunderstanding, we make it even more simple. So I think it's important to do that. And my own experience is you can never be too simple. You know, the reviewers will pick up quickly enough if you have written things in too simple a format. So just be a little bit careful about that. And the second thing I would say as well is think, you know, really try to, you know, to apply critical analysis and your own intelligent thinking to the writing of your papers. If you're sitting down to write that background introduction, a context, you have your original draft from your program or from the work that you've done, and you're thinking about the international audience, allow yourself to think and imagine who you're speaking to, what are the important points, and write from your own thoughts directly. If you've just read a few articles and you've thought of important points, write those points. Really try to think, interpret, analyze, and write using your own words, rather than relying on paraphrasing, and certainly no quotations. There should be almost no quotations in the written work. So pathways to success in writing for publication are planning, preparation, persistence, and perseverance. And I think overall, writing for any audience, but writing for a global audience requires all of those things, and then you'll be successful. So I hope that today you will have gained a greater understanding of the writing for publication process, in particular how to write for an international audience, and hope that this will hopefully help you to establish a way forward for successful publication with a particular focus on the Journal of Nursing Management. So I'd like to thank you very much for Mila Magat for your attention, and I'm very happy to have time to take some questions and to find out from you how that's sat with you in terms of your own experiences. Thank you.
There's a few questions in the chat, largely with language right now, you know, such as the way we might spell different words, like behavior and behavior being different. And also very contingent to that, there's some writers that their primary language is is not English. Are there services and our editors, can they access that could help translate it to simple English? Can you speak to those two?
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Laura. That's really interesting points. I suppose to say firstly that the journals, generally speaking, will be very open to authors whose first language is not English. We're kind of very aware that the scientific world, if you like, exists through English, and we miss a lot of very important work. So when I say expression and logical flow, and one of the main questions, you know, is it written in English? That issue doesn't necessarily apply to authors whose first language is English. It in fact applies to all authors. And my personal view is it's to do with inadequate paraphrasing or overuse of paraphrasing. So I suppose in short, good writing is good writing, and you know, whatever language it is in. And if we see what are very obvious issues to do with English, generally speaking, we would overlook those. It would not be a reason for rejection in the first instance. You know, it would be. So when we look at something that's rejected in terms of the language, it's very often that actually it just doesn't make sense, doesn't have a beginning, middle and end, doesn't have logical flow. And 50 times it's somebody who speaks English, including myself, you know, so it's actually more about that. But to answer your second question, do we have services? Yes, Wiley, for example, have editing services. I mean, I would suggest, and I have a lot of experience working with people whose first language not English, you know, helping them to write. And I think if you get the paper really, you know, well done in your own language, it can be helpful then maybe to have your own translation services, or have the translation. Yes, we wouldn't necessarily have translation services, we have editing services for English, but to have a translation service that will help you to translate, and then, you know, you could have an editing service. What I'm saying is, yes, good writing is good writing. Try, if English is not your first language, not to rely on the paraphrasing and the cutting and pasting, because that's where the difficulties come, more so than actually the language, if that makes sense.
It's very informative presentation, and I have a question though on. I'm going to ask a little bit more about that that global audience. Just as we would look through a journal to see what they published most recently, particularly looking for publications on the topic that we're writing for, should we also be looking at the journal to see where their authors are coming from, or is it primarily the editor's country of origin? How do we, because we couldn't write one article, I don't think. We can write an article to be more global, but like you mentioned, if you're writing about nurse practitioners in the United States and you're sending it to a journal that publishes more an international audience, again, how do you understand a little bit more about that origin of the journal or the editor, or,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? How do you
yeah.
do that? So you're writing for them.
Yeah, and I guess I mentioned Roger Watson there quite a lot, and now I'm going to mention Karen Holland, who was previous editor of Nurse Education and Practice, who co-wrote that book. And the reason I mention them is because when they give their workshops, you kind of get inside the brain of the editor-in-chief and you begin to understand it. And with Karen Holland, I began to understand over a number of years. She was the editor-in-chief of that journal from the day it was opened, so she had 22 years or more she knew every paper in that journal. So when you presented something on competency, nursing students competency, she had read all the other articles in that particular journal in relation to competency, and that was the context that she holds, and she judges the work that you bring in, generally speaking, in relation to the rest of what's happened before. So I suppose, in short, one thing that I would do just to help myself understand what Karen knows in her head is I would search for that topic in that journal. So you're right, if you're right, so you would effectively, as you say, how would you know? I mean, I think we've nearly 3,000 papers in journal nursing management. It's quite difficult to know every single one of them. But certainly if you search advanced practice, for example, you would get a good idea of trends and themes that would have happened. So you would know then what's in Karen Holland's mind. You know who you're speaking to, So yeah, you're right. Because if you look at that email I showed you earlier on, that's only in the last 2 months.
Yeah.
I've been rejected because you don't fit with the journal conversation. So you say, how do you fit with the journal conversation? By searching the journal. Some of it is even just sitting with the journal and reading, several articles from recent issues, just absorbing yourself in the actual journal, I suppose, and doing that piece of research so that you can get inside the head of the editor-in-chief, if you like, and get inside that conversation. And I keep equating it to attending a ceremony, like a wedding ceremony or something, where you wouldn't just arrive and rock up and start speaking about nursing. Let me tell you about nursing practice. Is it, you sit down quietly and discover, who's a nurse, who's done before, who else is in that table. So it's like that. I imagine it's like a big wedding, the journal, and you're trying to fit yourself with all that's gone before. You don't just dive in cold and sort of present yourself, if you like, or that's the best thing that you can do, I guess,
And should you have some articles from other countries in your bibliography on that topic to demonstrate that you looked at it from just not the perspective of your country?
Yeah, really good question. And just to say as well that one thing that we would be cautious around is I'm sort of, that's why I'm citing Roger Watson and others in terms of fit, because it's, this certainly is what we believe is that should fit. And I've shown you also an email showing that I didn't fit. So, but what we're not encouraging is artificial citation. So there's no sense that we're encouraging please cite from this journal, and that should never be the case, and it is a very serious offence if anybody, and I have seen it in fact where people would say, please cite 3 papers from this journal. That's not the game we're in at all. It's really, so, and on that note, to say that, I didn't say this, but another tip as well is don't over self-cite. Okay. So we don't want Karamanica, so we often have to start with, particularly someone who's expert in a field in a particular country, you sort of feel, well, they're your supervisor, you feel it should be, embellished for that reason, but in fact it shows a sort of very limited. So watch this, and also self-citations ethically are something that the Committee on Publication Ethics will be quite hot on as well, and they would observe that, and they would, so just be careful generally about self-citation. So to answer your question about the conversation, yeah, how much, I suppose, I have the paper, say a dissertation from a DMP program. Then I prepare for the journal. I do the research behind it, look at the guidelines. I start to put into the shape of the actual journal presentation style. I give it a title, I shorten it, and then I work in the background introduction, and I just begin to think about that subject in relation to what I mentioned earlier on the problem statement, why I did the research, what it means. I suppose I do a thinking job and imagine how what this means to the rest of the world. Do my best to just give us a clear explanation for a context and background for the study that I'm presenting, I guess, in a way. It's tricky, something like, and I take nothing for granted. For example, if you start to say, well, internationally nursing students are stressed. What's a nursing student? What's stress? So you have to start a very basic kind of conversation around, yeah. I think it's thinking.
Thank you so much. We have I just have a few announcements, and Dr. Timmons, thank you for a fabulous presentation. And, and there are only accolades in the, from the chat about this presentation and how good it was. And it was compact and it was extremely informative. So thank you. And thank you for coming all the way from Ireland to do this for us. So just want to remind everybody, please, that you have CEUs with this, 1 contact hours, and just fill out the survey link for your evaluation, and then you will get your certificate. I also want to let you know that we have 2 more webinars coming up that are planned. We will be having them monthly, except we do take a month off in the summer. But our next one is in February, on February 22nd. We're going to look at leadership strategies for pandemic management and long-term care. And I know all of us are trying to make that lens a little broader and not just be focused on acute care. And then we're going to have another editor talking with us, and that's Dr. Bloom, and she is going to talk about contributing your expertise as a peer reviewer, because now we're going to look at the other side of how do we steward the profession by being good peer reviewers. And last but not least, I want to remind you that we are going to have a conference this year in November 3rd and 5th. We will be in Cleveland, Ohio, and we are going to be at Case Western Reserve University at the Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing. So it's exciting, and we're going to have lots. I'm just looking forward to having another in-person conference after all of these years of virtual. So look forward and watch for that. And thank you all for being here today. And thank you again, Dr. Timmons. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Apologies. Can I just, sorry, Laura, to have the final word. I forgot to answer your question there about the American or English spelling. Generally, if you check with the author guidelines, they will let you know one or the other. And generally, once you're consistent, it's accepted in either for most journals. But just one point I just noticed there in the chat about May, people asked a very good question about if you're not paraphrasing, how are you being true to the other author's material?
Oh,
but just to give you one,
sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, but it's a very interesting point, because it just gives a good example of how you can kind of make an error. So often the findings are some, say, for example, emergency nurses and violence. One study will find that these practitioners reported a high level of violence. The next study will find that these ED nurses found a high level of violence. The next study will find that these advanced practitioners. So if you actually take the words exactly as they are and believe that you are not allowed to alter them in any way, you'll actually have this gobbledygook mix of about 5 different words to call a nurse. Do you know what I mean? So this is what, obviously something like 50% is or statistics, it may be difficult to maneuver, but generally speaking, you're expected to take those findings and not just expected, it's better for you to put them into your own words, because that allows interpretation. Again, back to your wedding, you wouldn't discuss your daughter or your friend in 5 different ways at the table. I mean, you'd say, this is my friend. You wouldn't say, this is my friend, and the next thing I'm talking, have 5 different words for that person, if that makes sense. We don't do that when we speak. So don't do it when you write. Does that make sense? Allow yourself to interpret. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does. Well, again,
thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.